Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. We're going to pick up from some of the last pieces of the discussion in the first panel. My name is Beth Woroniuk. As Paulette said, I am the Vice President Policy at the Equality Fund. And hopefully we'll get a chance over the course of this panel to tell you a little bit about the work that we do as well. I use she, her pronouns. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Nkoch. I think this is a really important way to start because it's a reminder that Indigenous people have walked these lands since time immemorial, long before the project of European colonization. And it's something that we're doing more and more in Canada as an acknowledgement of this territory, and I would just like to bring that into this room here today. As the song said, we're here to talk about money. It's actually, as came up in the previous panel, it's a really popular topic, and it can also be a really difficult topic. As was also mentioned, we talk about feminist foreign policy and the R's of feminist foreign policy. Rights, representation, resources is one of those three. And the Feminist Foreign Policy Collaborative has added reach and research, which we'll probably hear a little bit more about tomorrow. One of the things that a lot of feminist activists say is that a commitment without resources is not a commitment. And that's what we're going to explore today, some of the ins and outs of feminist foreign policy and resourcing for feminist movements. So why is this important? Well, we heard a little bit in the previous panel about the key role that transnational feminist movements, that strong, independent feminist movements play. We know that they're absolutely crucial to progress on gender equality, LGBTQ rights, women's rights. But we have a growing research and documentation that strong, independent feminist movements are also really important in achieving other political, economic, and social goals. We heard the intersections in the previous panel about climate, progress on climate, and independent women's movements. And we're seeing this around the struggles around democracy and anti-authoritarianism that also came up this morning. Yet, despite this growing awareness, women's rights organizations, gender justice organizations receive a fraction of official development assistance. In fact, the latest figures that we have from the OECD DAC, which coordinates and collects all the statistics on development assistance, was that in the last period, the funding to women's rights organizations actually decreased. And we're already talking about peanuts, going from 574 million, that's what it was in 2021, down from 580 million. That's nothing compared to the billions that moves in international assistance every year. So that's a very worrisome trend, especially when that covers the period where we had the Generation Equality Forum, where there were multiple calls for resourcing for feminist movements. So we have a small but mighty panel for you today. One of our panelists, we did have someone from the Global Affairs Canada, from the Government of Canada, who unfortunately tested positive along with her daughter for COVID this morning. So she's unable to join us. And as Paulette was saying, Memory Kachambwa, we hope that she'll make it for the tail end of the panel. She's also, one of the realities of today, has had trouble, delays in her flights. But with us today, we do have two excellent speakers to help elaborate on some of these questions. We have Monica Aleman, who's the International Program Director, Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice from the Ford Foundation. And something you may not know about Monica, those of you in this room, is that she's an avid painter. And I understand that Monica, what was you told us, Monica? You paint women, boats, and villages. And we also have France Bognon, who's the program director of the Innovative Peace Fund at the International Civil Society Action Network, ICANN. And France was telling us that her childhood, she was raised with 12 foster siblings. So brave parents that you have. And this has inspired her to support a dog shelter and find foster homes for dogs. And France also fosters dogs herself. So these two people bring an incredible diversity to these conversations. So we're going to open up the conversation. Monica, with you first, if we can. The Ford Foundation supports both feminist organizations and organizations working on feminist foreign policy. So what do you see as the connection? Why do you support both of these groups? And what's the importance here?
Hello, everyone. How are we doing this afternoon? Are you okay? You're seeming a little quiet down there. I want to start by saying that today, in the Mayan calendar, is the day of the Tajiks, which is the day of the obsidian stone. And it's a stone that brings healing and clearing. And interesting enough, and I don't know if the Women's Funding Network knew this, but tomorrow is the day of the Kawak. The day of the Kawak is Women's Day in the Mayan calendar. So it is the day where we bring our full femininity into the room. So with that energy of healing, of cleansing, and bringing our full femininity in the room, I can answer some of those questions. I will say, I think the first important thing to note is that we at the Ford Foundation do not see a dichotomy between funding women's rights organizations and funding those who are advocates of feminist foreign policy. So we don't see that distinction. I think that it is important to recognize that all of us have different roles to play in the larger struggle for gender equality and women's rights in this work. And it is in that sense important for us to channel resources directly to organizations who are responding to the critical needs of communities right now, as much as those organizations who are working at the policy level and who are trying to change some of the rules of the game. And the reason that that is important is because we need to be able to fund some of the symptoms of inequality as much as it is important for us to fund the imagination of the new systems. So I will say that's how we see it. And why do we think feminist foreign policy is important? We think that it is important because ultimately it's deeply connected, as the panelists were alluding earlier, to official development assistance or to how the money is flowing. So having strong advocates in that field and building an infrastructure of organizations to be able to sustain their advocacy in that field is important in defining how money ultimately needs to be circulating in the world. So I will say we recognize that that is critical for us to drive long-term change, because the money that Ford brings to the table, even though it's an important amount. You know, we allocate around 800 million a year. We made a commitment in the last 2 years that at least 400 million will be dedicated to gender equality. And this year, we are bringing additional resources out of our reserves to responding to the backlash. Is decent, but not nearly enough, the scale of the problem. So investing in an infrastructure of feminist organizations that is able to ultimately track and define how finances flow in the world is important.
Great, thanks for that. I think it's really interesting to think about the ecosystem and the infrastructure and the different roles that people play. And just so, Franz, I'm wondering if you have any comments to follow up on that. You work a lot with women peace builders. How do they see themselves fitting into this infrastructure of different players and actors on resources and feminist foreign policy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. I hate to start out with my first sentence being negative, but it's not a positive outlook from peace builders on the ground. They see it as a lot of rhetoric. And I think just as was pointed out today, our panelists earlier noted how there's an increase in countries that are adopting feminist foreign policies. This has been directly corresponded with the decrease in funding that's going to gender equality. So on the outskirt, the optics of it don't look great, right? They're also, it's not just the matter of the amount of funding that's going out, it's also the type of funding and the mechanisms by which that funding is getting to the ground. There is a current European donor who's we don't have to name and shame here, but they are a feminist they have a feminist foreign policy, and yet when compared to the other mechanisms of funding that come down from other donors, Canada is looking pretty good, but they have some of the strictest administrative requirements and the most rigid time and implementation period. And so they have a really great document about what feminist foreign policy means for them. It includes the importance of resourcing women peace builders, but unfortunately, that weighed against their financial restrictions and their responsibility to their constituents means that actually the funds aren't getting to the ground in the manner or in the amount that would be needed. I think there's also a bit of disappointment in just how political, and this was alluded to on the last panel, on how political this is, right? I mean, Sweden being a perfect example. They were the pioneer in terms of feminist foreign policy, and last year with the change of government, they had also really been an advocate. There was a UN Security Council resolution on financing for peace building that came out last year, and the Swedes were championing it. And the resolution came out, their government changed, and they basically have reduced drastically the amount of funds that go to the ground. So there's a lot of talk, but very little action in terms of what, for those peace builders on the ground, in terms of what having a feminist foreign policy really means.
Okay, so you've put a real challenge on the table in terms of the critique, and you make this point that is so often made that it's not just increasing the quantity of resources flowing to movements, it's the quality of that money, of what the terms are, what the bureaucracy is, whether it's project or whether it's flexible. So that makes sense. Can you maybe give us some examples of when movements, when organizations receive funding like that? What can they do? What difference does it make? And so why is it important that we keep talking about this quality of funding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can say the Innovative Peace Fund, the program that I run, is the only independent fund that is dedicated to supporting women-led peace-building organizations in conflict countries. So it's the only one that isn't tied to the UN or to any other infrastructure. What we were able to do is we can only be as flexible as the donors who give to the fund, which is mostly bilateral and some philanthropic. But when COVID came, it provided this opportunity that nobody really knew what to do. Normal activities couldn't continue as they had been proposed initially. So we went back to the donors and said, listen, we can't ask for the money back. These organizations either need to survive, or if they die, the ability to build back the institutions after COVID comes will be 10 times more challenging. We will have gone back about 22 decades. So a lot of donors started being a little bit more open to what this like flexible funding means. And I think everybody probably has their own interpretation of what flexible funding means. And I think a lot of it is kind of the administrative requirements that you mentioned, Beth, and kind of the hurdles, the financial, the audits, the reporting periods, the results frameworks, all that kind of project stuff. But I think above and beyond the administrative hurdles is really this question of trust, right? And it's trusting in the partners who are doing this work, and it's trusting that it's trusting their expertise and their knowledge, right? It's trusting that they can define their own priorities, that they're best positioned to define the interventions that will meet those priorities, and that you can trust that actually it's not about their audits or their financial reporting, which is necessary and which we do for our own accountability, but really that in order for them to be able to be successful in their interventions that they've identified, they need to have the flexibility to be able to adapt, right? Both in terms of meeting the changing conditions on the ground, which is really, really relevant in conflict contexts, but also to be able to adapt to when they see an opportunity, they can seize it, right? And they don't have to come back to the donor and say, oh, sorry, we were invited to the table to sit down with this group, but it wasn't in our program objectives, so I guess we'll have to say no. So I think if that is one of the elements too, to me, that's relevant of a feminist foreign policy, is that element of trust, of trusting the ground and not looking at them as implementers, but looking at them as partners. So I guess there's a lot of examples that I could cite, but there are kind of two that came to mind when I was thinking about this yesterday. One would be, we have a partner in, it's a Syrian organization in southern Turkey. And when there was an influx of refugees coming over the border, she was trying to figure out, there had been increase in violence. There's also a lot of tensions between the Syrian population and the Turkish populations there. And so she kind of identified that the first ingredient to any peace building was to equip the women on the ground with literacy skills, with economic empowerment, and with psychosocial support. Those are not typically three areas that are seen as peace building, right? And much of the funding that goes for peace building is really restrictive to kind of conflict resolution mediation. So with flexible funding from a donor that we had that was able to channel it through the IPF, we were able to give her the freedom, right, to be able to look at this program and this group, this community holistically. And so she was able to integrate all these parts and recognizing that in order for the women to start to address the higher rates of conflict in their community, they needed to first be able to deal with their own trauma, and they needed to have some independence from the livelihood skills, and they needed to have some computer skills and some language skills. They were refugees. So a flexible fund allowed her to kind of wrap this all into one, rather than, oh no, we're just gonna do mediation, right? I'm just gonna teach these poor women who don't have food, who don't have homes, who are being abused in their own families, the mediation skills. So I think that was one important point. And if I have time, I can give one other, or do you want me to wait?
Maybe
I'll wait.
We'll get back to it. 'Cause
I'll come
I
back.
do want to hear from Monica on this, but I think that you've raised some really interesting points about that integrated, about the number of different issues or intersectional way that women's rights organizations approach some of these issues. Monica, we do hear a lot. France mentioned trust, and we hear a lot now about trust-based philanthropy. We hear this. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this conversation on the quality of the money and why that's important too?
Well, I guess two things. There are two difficult things to give away when you are sitting in an institution like the Ford Foundation and many other philanthropic organizations. And the first difficult thing to give away is your ego. And the second is your power. It's very, very hard because many of us are, and many institutions that are providing the funding today are self-centered and believe that, they are the most important player in the field, and they certainly want to take credit for anything that you do, including your own existence as an organization. So I don't think we can have the conversation around trust without having the conversation around understanding what a shift in power means, and around understanding how deep-seated this desire for our ego and recognizing us is in the sector. So that's one thing. Of course, in the last 5 years, the Ford Foundation has tried to integrate a certain set of structures and principles and incentives to try to interrogate the question of how power is exercised in the relationship between a program officer and a grantee partner. It has also changed the way our budget is being done, and in fact, has created an incentive inside the organization where the performance of program officers is measured by the amount of general support grants that they provide to organization. And when we see that, that is directly reflected on your performance at the end of the year and the things that come with having a good performance. So we have tried to create some technical incentives to promote the giving of general support. We are proud that in a period of 5 years, we have gone from 80% project support to now 80% general support inside the organization. But it's not, so I will say it's not easy. It's not easy. Why? Because many of us come to this sector with our own ideas about what change is, what development is, what prosperity looks like. And in the negotiation of a grant, we obviously want to transmit that idea and are only happy if we see that reflected back in the documents that come through our desk. So it requires a tremendous level of deep transformation inside yourself, because you can have many structural changes, but many of you are donors here. Many of you, whether you are working through partnership or in whichever way you are working, So if you're not asking yourself the question of, how am I managing power and my own self in this conversation, then we are not doing enough, But that's one. I mean, the other thing that I think is important is to recognize that, again, despite of the amount of money that we put on the table, is not enough. And what the Ford Foundation continues to struggle to do is to reach grassroots organizations. The size of our grant is about $200,000 in average a year. And and many organizations are in a process of growth, but not all organizations are ready to be recipients of funds from Ford. So I will say that is something that we still have to tackle. So, and I mention this because the question of trust, the question of ego, and the question of power is also experienced and interpreted to a screen on who is the person you're talking to, And sometimes there is this misconception in the funding community that when you come from a grassroots organization, you're not necessarily have the level of sophistication and preparedness to be able to partner. So I will say we are not exempted from that. You know, we have a journey to go in recognizing that that we have to reimagine who and maybe not even reimagine. That's too much. We just have to recognize that the real drivers of change right now on the ground are not necessarily the ones who are receiving this funding that I am talking about, because there are several layers for us to be able to go down. You know, and once we go down to that, then it requires not only changing our ego and our power, but also our biases and our racist biases that are driving, you know, who we are and the decisions that we are making.
Can I respond to that, Beth, quickly?
Sure, go ahead.
Just because I find it really interesting that there's often a discussion about capacity building support. And I kind of wonder, like, what are we asking of our partners on the ground, right? Because really they need to be experts in their community, in conflict analysis, in context analysis, in actually engaging different stakeholders. They need to know how to talk to religious actors and politicians. They know how to reach the locals. In my work, they need to be able to talk to extremist groups and terrorists. But really, at the same time, we're asking them through our funding to become the best at proposal writing, which means what? Right? And whose proposal? Because everybody has a different format. They have to be the best at results frameworks. I mean, I struggle myself with results framework and went through training. They have to be the best at reporting. They have to be able to also speak about their work in international spaces, as well as connect on the local ground. I just think we're asking infinity of these groups who have this much resources compared to where we sit and in our infrastructure, and we're asking them to be good at something that we're not actually giving them funding to be good at. Right? So when we talk about capacity building, I think, and it's part of what the fund that I work with does, we try to take that burden of the proposal writing and the reporting and the M&E and all of that off of them and let them just do what they're good at and be the connections to the ground that we need and let them be the voices down there so that we can actually, so that they can have the space, right? And I just think it's I think it's a conundrum, and we're forcing with all these capacity building workshops. I think it's a waste of time.
Yeah, great. Okay, you've raised power, ego, racism, who's an expert, all kinds of complications when we talk about moving money that make this a complicated system. And just a quick anecdote, there was one funder that I know that was reviewing a proposal of an organization, and they were down into the nitty-gritty of the budget, and they said, you have a line item here for 13 chairs, but you only have 12 employees, so why do you need 13 chairs? That's the kind, that's not trust-based funding or philanthropy, right? That's not where we want to go with this. I have one more question to you both, and then I want to open it up for comments or questions from the audience. So clearly people are advocating for trust-based philanthropy, for more resources to feminist movements, to resources that meet the needs of the organization, to value the expertise that these organizations have. Clearly, we have a ways to go. So what advice do you have to the people in this room? Monica, do you have advice for activists on how this argument could be made better? France, how's it looking from your perspective? Where do you see gains being made? And what advice do you have to the funders in this room on how they could help carry this message forward? Monica, over to you first.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the first advice is perhaps to change the way we are having the conversations. First of all, to move from a transactional conversation where you are fundraising to a conversation where you are having a political negotiation, because ultimately, it's about, It's about politics, and it is about a set of beliefs that you are talking about in that conversation. And if you believe in the capacity, in the power, in the philosophy of that particular individual, how the money moves is irrelevant. You know, the actual way in which that money is going to be given is not what ultimately define where you're putting your resources. So I will say the first thing is to shift the way we are having the conversations amongst ourselves. And for many advocates here to know that you certainly have more power than you might think. Even though this is a group that is very empowered, you know, but I do think that it is important to know that there is no success in the story of the Ford Foundation without you. You know, there is no social justice philanthropy without the recipients of the funds. You know, so in that sense, we need you to look good. You know, so it is important for you to always remember that. You know, and you are doing tremendously well in terms of the work and the innovation and the projects and the ideas that you're moving, and we want to be associated with that. So just remember that you have more power than you think you have, because I cannot do good, I cannot look good, I cannot even feed my own ego if I don't fund you. Yeah, so.
Great. Ron?
So a couple years ago, I guess in 2020, after about 5 years of running the fund, we started seeing all the obstacles that there were to getting money and resources to the ground. And so we did an analysis across 40 different countries of what the barriers were, but then also to look really forward thinking at what the solutions are, and recognizing who our audience was, and that you really need to be very explicit in what you mean. So when you say create more equitable relationships, you just kind of get blank stares of how. So what we did was we created a report and operational guidance called Funding Women Peace Builders Dismantling Barriers. But the annex to it is actually a funding framework for action, which breaks it down into kind of 4 main categories of what the primary obstacles are, and then a how-to of how donors should actually take those. And there's like a checkbox. So it's like, have we actually, and I could give you tons of examples, but so that they know what actual policies they need to change. What was interesting is that when we did all this research, and we had our methodology, we had our discussions, and we were getting down to drafting the report and the paper, we started realizing that there were a lot of technical issues, which is the implementation period, the report writing, the objectives, the requirements, but that actually there were a ton of top-level issues as well. And I think that this gets exactly to what Monica just said, is like, it was the issues of ego and of power. And if you don't have a supportive ecosystem in place, it doesn't matter how many kind of technical issues. It's like having a plane and you get like all that, you fix the seats and you fix the food, but the engine's not working, right? You're not gonna go anywhere. So we broke the analysis down, and many of our suggestions are how you change it so that you have a more welcoming, donors can have a more welcoming international like policy, right? And some of those policies include actual recognition of the value of women, right? Recognition of the contributions that they make on the ground, and really, I guess the ability to have consultations that aren't just, okay, yes, check a box, we have this consultation and make it tokenistic, but actually truly integrating women, local women's organizations into defining priorities, right? So even around who's being funded and how the funding is going, they should be consulting organizations on the ground and incorporating their viewpoints. And I think everybody knows this, so I don't need to elaborate on it much more. But it was quite sad that we saw how few donors are doing this. And one example that I'd mentioned to Beth earlier is there's a European donor who is funding, doing a lot of work in Afghanistan. And anybody who follows in Afghanistan, about 2 months ago, there was a recent edict that all organizations now have to register their projects with the Ministry of Economy there. So many organizations won't be doing that, like we've done in Egypt, like we've done in many other countries, because it would flag them and be a danger. That donor actually came back to us and said, no, they have to register. And I'm like, so you're gonna force them to put themselves at risk? And said, yes, but the risk for us if we don't, and it's found out that it's funded by our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, like it would just be really difficult. That is the complete opposite of trust. And again, this is a primary donor, which I'm sure funds a lot of the organizations here. So it gets back to the question of the notion of trust, and I think that what I would recommend, and I won't have time to go through all the recommendations, or the 4 recommendations, but I think a lot, like the primary ones I would say, the 2 take away are put your money where your mouth is and put your mouth where your money is, right? So there's a lot of talk about the importance of feminist foreign policies and of investing in local organizations and sending resources to what's currently the Global South, but they don't actually do it, right? It's just in the policy documents. Even after the UN Security Council resolution on financing for peace building, the rate of funding for peace building has gone down, and we have a Security Council resolution on it. So, and then the other thing I would say is, and everybody knows this, so it's gonna sound repetitive, but we need to be supporting institutions, right? We need to be making sure that the organizations that are doing this work are sustainable over a protracted period, a prolonged period of time. And if you're just funding, if you're focused on the project and the project outcomes and the activities, you're not actually focusing on the health of that organization or of that institution, and it will fail, right? So we can talk a little bit more about what that means if there's time, but would want to open it to the floor.
Great. Okay, so lots of good arguments, points in there, and I think it does relate really nicely to the first panel and talking about looking at more deeply when we're talking about feminist foreign policies, not just adding more women, but interrogating these notions of power, of results, of risk, of what constitutes risk and to whom. There is a lot of expertise in this room. So what I'd like to do is open up the conversation a little more, and we have mics, 1 or 2, and if we could get a couple of comments, questions, we'll collect a few and then come back to our 2 panelists for their observations and remarks. We have a handy mic runner for us here. If you could introduce yourself too, please.
Doesn't sound on.
Sorry. Hey, my name is Janice, she, her pronouns, Yellowhammer Fund and Margins, Women Helping Black Women. My question is, how do we, because I know of the Ford Foundation, and I know the intentionality y'all have approached funding with, how do we further bridge that gap with grassroots organizations? I'm in Alabama, and nobody wants to fund Alabama, but even when it does, it's those people that everybody knows, and it doesn't make it to the ground. I run an organization named Margins that I started when I was homeless. I got some other Black women together and started crowdsourcing. We fed 200 families repeatedly over COVID from crowdfunding. We had a bunch of women leave domestic violence from just the action alone. And we've built the entirety of what we do off of meeting people where they're at, and then those people joining us and moving forward. None of us are being paid for the work. How do we bridge that gap with grassroots organizations? I'm here by sheer luck. So the people that look like me or that are organizing with me could never afford to be here. How do we bridge the gap with funding? We're doing it with less than $200,000 a year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Work. Great question. Can we take a couple more, and then I'll ask France and Monica to respond.
Hi, thanks. First of all, thank you to the 3 of you very much for this great panel and the work that you do. I'm Sandra Malone. I'm at Oasis Sahel and Search for Common Ground. And I have a question for you, both France and Monica. Right now, it is pretty dire. the way in which the US is rolling back domestically on rights generally. But as you've mentioned, of course, it's pretty dire also, the effect of our politics here on monies that no longer will be flowing, likely, to peace building and women's rights across the planet. So just on the hopeful side, could you just give us a couple key entree points, institutions, peoples, parties who have an influence currently and where we should really be knocking on their doors? Of course, some of our colleagues and we were on the Hill and we understand a little bit about that part. But who else will make this shift forward happen for the US and for women's rights around the world?
Great. So where do we look for allies? Where are some of the other doors we can knock on? Do we have another?
How many more do you want?
Two more? Two more, if we have them?
3? I see 3 hands.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll try and do another round. We'll do 2 more. Hi.
Hi, I'll try to be quick with mine. So we at WeDo have for many years undertaken the project of trying to shift the flows of finance from a large-scale macroeconomic perspective of particularly shifting climate finance flows, centering gender equality, making sure they're reaching grassroots women, indigenous women organizations, and continue to do that work, but also recognize that fundamentally those spaces are just not fit for purpose for actually delivering on finance. And so in the past 5 years or so have been working on, which sounds like a similar work to the Innovative Peace Fund, changing the scope of delivery mechanisms. So not only what is the role that feminist philanthropy have, but what is the role that advocacy organizations such as my own have as in being a resource ally, in being a resource redistributor. How can we make that a part of our collective strategic planning? Because we need such a diverse ecosystem to actually be delivering on funding. And what we're seeing, even as we use maybe the leverage of feminist foreign policy to get governments to commit their development dollars to the intersection of gender and climate, 90% of that funding, for example, in Canada, goes via MDBs. And so we're back in this cycle of reform where we know that this money is not going to flow and it's not going to be fit for purpose. My question is really around, as we're doing this work, we have an event next week on funding gender-just climate solutions and how we need the global community to think in a diversity of scale and alternative delivery mechanisms. We're still talking about intermediaries in a space where there's a lot of calls for direct funding. And I guess my question comes back to this. I was really struck by what our analysis is as well, is we are asking too much of grassroots communities to be the funder, the proposal writer, et cetera. And yet there's that call for direct funding as well. So how do we balance creating an ecosystem of, is it possible, of feminist intermediaries or this diversity of scale in terms of who is redistributing resources so that they can get where they need to go without putting that burden of delivery and capacity strengthening, et cetera, so that folks who are doing necessary on the ground work can continue to do that. Yeah.
Great. We need another panel on women's funds. We have some around. The Equality Fund is one. Let's do one more question, and then I'm going to turn to the panel.
Oh. Hi, my name is Sophia Sewell. Thanks for your comments. I'm from Fair Share of Women Leaders. I'm here with my colleague Tatu, and we work on women in leadership and feminist leadership in the international civil society sector. And we're based in Berlin. Most of our team is because that's where we were founded, and we're also trying to spark this conversation on feminist funding in the German sector. And while the work here is obviously not done here in the US, in Germany, let's just say it's quite a few stages behind. And so I wonder if you have any insights or learnings you can share from being part of this movement towards feminist funding in the US that you think would transfer across countries and contexts that we could keep in mind as we're trying to spark a similar change. Thank you.
Great. How do we consolidate some of these lessons and what's transferable? Okay, really good questions. I know we don't have time to answer all of them, and maybe we can get a few more. Do you have some brief thoughts, reflections on this, on allies and how to push this forward? How, Monica, you raised it before, the challenge of funding at the grassroots, and are there pathways that are working? Lessons from you. Monica, do you want to reflect first?
Yes, I mean, yes, I have an answer. I have some speaking points I was given when I was leaving the Ford Foundation, in case that question was to be asked. I don't know if you will like the answer. So, but I will say so far, our answer has been that we make a bet that a key strategy to bridge that gap is to provide funding to women's funds or other type of intermediary organizations. And I recognize that women's funds are more than intermediary organizations, but that has been one of the strategies, and the way we provide funding to the many women's funds that are partners of ours is by giving them the grant with a one-line budget, and that gives them the type of flexibility that they need for them to fund in more innovative ways than we can at scale. I will say, though, there are teams across the entire organizations who are beginning to feel more comfortable with experimentation and risk. And what that is doing is that is opening the door in a more systematic manner to channel resources directly. But it's still at an early stage, I will say. But you might find across the entire organization program officers and programs that are willing to go out of their way and provide grants to grassroots organization, and then work with you through a growth period. So if you have a budget that is 200 right now, obviously you will have to think what is the size of that grant that can come from an institution like Ford. But that doesn't mean you have to stay there, so we can work with you at a certain stage right now, but next year at a different stage, and next year at a whole different stage, so that we are growing with you as you are growing the budget of your organization. There are so many organizations who don't want to grow the budget because that's the way they want to remain. They want to remain movement anchored, and they don't want to add themselves the burden of necessarily becoming a massive nonprofit operation. And in those cases, it is very, very difficult for us to provide funding for them. And again, the only mechanism that we have right now is funding that is going through intermediary organization. And in this sector, it's mostly women's and feminist funds, which are not only women's funds, but also feminist funds. Again, examples of that are our funding for the Black Feminist Fund, and that was a substantial amount of resources. Our funding for the Equality Fund, our funding for New Moon Fund, our funding for the African Women's Development Fund, the Central American Women's Development Fund, and a whole list of women's funds. To tell you the truth, I don't know enough about the work in the US, but I can take it as homework and put some pressure on those teams. If you tell me to go and do that, I don't have anything to be fair, so. But just to say, I am always ready to take a fight on your behalf, inside the organization. That's not a headache. That is the job that we came here to do. That's why we come to those institutions. We come to with a mandate of moving resources to the people that need the resources, and that if that means, having your resignation letter on your pocket, then you have it, because you're there with a mission. I am not at the Ford Foundation to have a tremendous career. Of course, I will fight for my salary and for my compensation and be well, because we all need to have that. But I am not there just for that, or that is the least of things. I am there because I am interested in the entire endowment, which is $18 billion. That's the money that I would like us to have, not the one that we are getting right now. So I will say, yes, let's think together, let's strategize together, because there is the money that is going out the door, but there is also the money that is sitting in many endowments, and there is a need for all of us to think more politically and more strategically about how do we make the case. And that's what I mean, moving from having a conversation around one grant and how we support your organization, to you sitting together with me and others and thinking, okay, what is the kind of conversation we need to be having with Darren Warkett and the trustees of the Ford Foundation? So it's moving beyond that transaction. I think that it's very, very urgent for us to be able to do that and to do it, at a time where the demands are in front of us. So that's one thing. On the question of the U.S., I have no idea. Or Germany. That is not something I can dare to answer. The only thing that I know we need to do is to continue to make the case to invest in organizations, because you will know what needs to be done, more than myself. These are very complex institutions. My hope is that we can transform them, because it's necessary. My hope is that we can work with them, because it is essential for us to realize our aspirations. I don't know the specific strategies or tactics, but what I know is that in order for us to sustain change, there is no escaping from investing in building the infrastructure of the feminist movement in any of the countries where we are talking about. So.
Brilliant. We are so glad that you are where you are and making this case so eloquently. We just have a couple of minutes left, Franz. And I know you probably have comments given those questions. And if I can just ask you to focus a little bit, because it relates to what Monica was saying, it relates to what lessons, it relates, I think, to part of Bridget's question. We know that the gender equality or women's funding are tiny pots, right? Like they're restricted. And so if we want to fund movements at scale, if we want to fund them generously, we have to start mobilizing money that's earmarked technically for other themes, right? You're trying to do this with peace building money. So can you reflect, are there lessons there on how we mobilize resources for feminist movements outside of the teeny tiny gender equality envelopes? And the last word is yours.
That is about a 20-minute question, so that I've been given less than 2 minutes for. No, I think it's a really good point. I do also want to make the point, because it's relevant. We talk about funding gender equality. There is a difference between funding gender equality and funding women's movements, right? And funding women's organizations. And I think that often gets lost in the thread, because a lot of our bilateral donors have indicators that they say, oh, we funded gender equality, 40% of our funds. But very often they funded men's organizations to do what they consider gender equality. And at ICANN, we don't see those as the same. There is a real importance of funding actually women to do that work. In terms of the linking together the questions with the different pots, Germany, it's still new. We'll see what happens. We'll be with the Dutch. We'll be in Holland at the beginning of November for their Shaping Feminist Foreign Policy. We advised the Germans on funding. They said that they took some of it. We'll see what happens. Inshallah, it'll actually come out into fruition. I think one of the things that we need to look at when we talk about where the funding is coming from and how we're funding is that the way that we view it at our organization is that it's a holistic approach, right? Like, I'll never forget the first time I was in Tunisia and one of our partners said, oh, I'd like to introduce, they were talking to someone else, you to our donor. And I kind of looked around and I was like, oh, there are donors here. That's lovely. They were looking at me. I was like, oh, no, I'm not a donor. I'm a partner, right? Like, we don't see ourselves as sitting in a seat of just accessing funds and handing them over. It's about the solidarity. It's about the professional courtesy. It's about the organizational support of like making sure that their voices are present in spaces that we've been given a platform to speak. So I think if we just look at it as just a mechanism of funding, we will get lost in the bigger picture of what our sisters need from us, right? It's not just mundane, it's actually for us to be a support network that they don't have. There's a lot of protection needs that they will come to us for. So when we go to different donors, we look at security pots, which is really difficult. I think peace building falls in this really awkward crevice of the peace builders won't fund us because they think we're too feminist, and then we miss out on some of the feminist funds because it's a peace and security, it's women, peace and security. So we're sitting in this kind of weird intersection. I think one of the most important takeaways for me, and Beth, we talked about this a couple of years ago, is trying to promote donor coordination, right? To have donors hold themselves accountable. And there was a question here of like, what would be the inroads? I think there's a lot of focus on localization now. There's a lot more talk even in the US from the State Department about the importance of localization. The question is how, right? So if each of us, when we go to make our advocacy pleas, rather than just saying trust, equitable relationships, more funding, actually explain to them literally these are the two things that we want to see happen in 2023. And can you make those happen? Because if you give them our full list of equitable and transparent funding, they'll end up with nothing. So I would say when you find your stakeholder, when you find your key entree points, just make sure that you're really particular about what that is. And we need to do a better job of having the different donors hold themselves accountable. I would love, I think a huge kudos to the Ford Foundation, to Rockefeller Brothers Fund, to Plowshares. Like there's a bunch of other foundations who give really flexible institutional support, which enables a lot of our organizations to survive. Our work is inherently political. We can't do it without bilateral donors, as much as I wish we could just forget them and move on. So they need to coordinate and collaborate together as well. And if we can push a donor coordination group among them where they're actually talking about the challenges they have with their own funding and how they're achieving that. So if the Canadians can talk to the Germans, can talk to the Brits, I think we'll get far further in the amount of time than just us sitting in this room asking for what we need.
Great. So we know the personal is political. We also know funding is political, and we need the political conversation. So please give it up for this fabulous panel.